Welcome to this complete guide to ASP.NET Core Identity course. In the first section, we're going to look under the hood of ASP.NET Core Authentication and Authorization without using identity, so that we can have a complete understanding of how ASP.NET Core Identity works and what are the purpose of those objects that we're going to use in ASP.NET Core Identity, and what are the purposes and how they achieve what they achieve. Right, so this is really the under the hood section. We're going to learn about security in general, right? And then authentication and authorization flows. We're going to learn about what are identities, what are principles, right? What is security context, and then we're going to start implement login page. We're going to generate cookies to sustain and remember who the user is, right? Remember those identities. And then we're going to read the security context from the cookie. And then we're going to learn about how authorization works in the ASP.NET Core. And we're going to create policies with claims. We're going to also implement a custom policy-based authorization scenario, which we can use to cover complicated cases. So after we understand how exactly authentication and authorization works in ASP.NET Core for web applications, in the second section, we are moving on to securing web APIs. Web APIs, instead of using cookie, typically we use tokens. So in this section, we're going to learn about Jwt Tokens. We're going to implement the Jwt token authentication, and we're going to learn how to encapsulate claims in Jwt token. We're going to implement the whole Jwt token authentication and authorization flows. And then we are going to also implement authorizations with Jwt tokens. In the third section, this is when we really get into ASP.NET Core Identity, but with the complete understanding of how ASP.NET Core Authentication Authorization works. It's very easy to understand how ASP.NET Core Identity works, right? We're going to learn about the essential parts of the identities. We're going to learn about what problem identity actually resolves. What's the knowledge that we have learned so far? And then we're going to configure ASP.NET Core Identity, and we started code with ASP.NET Core Identity to cover typical scenarios like user registration, right? User login, email confirmation, signing in, signing out, collecting user information. We're going to learn about roles, as well as we're going to create user profile pages and be able to update user information. And then in the fourth section, we're going to learn about MFA with ASP.NET Core Identity. So MFA stands for multi-factor authentication, right? We're going to learn about how it works, and then we're going to start implementing with email multi-factor authentications, and then moving on to Authenticator app multi-factor authentication, right? And finally, last but not least, we're going to learn about external authentication providers. I'm going to use Facebook as an example. We're going to learn about how OAuth works in general, because multi-factor authentication usually depends on OAuth, right? And then we're going to create a Facebook application, and then we're going to link our web application to Facebook, and we're going to start implementing the delegation to Facebook so that we can complete our course. This course is definitely not just a theory course. It contains a lot of practice, a lot of coding. By the end of the course, you will be able to understand how exactly ASP.NET Core Identity works, what problem it resolves, and you will be able to use every single part of ASP.NET Core Identity to secure your web applications, to secure your web APIs. Please feel free to look into the course and watch all of those free preview videos. I'm very excited to see you in my course. In this video, we're going to learn about security on a high level, so that you have a very solid understanding of what security really is, what are the key concepts in security, including security context, authentication, and authorization. Let's imagine this is a military base, right? There's a security guard, and this is you trying to get into the yard, right? So you go here, and the security guard will ask you to show your identity, right? You cannot just say who I am. The person will not believe you. So you have to show your identity card that will actually make sense to the security guard, right? Every person have many different type of identities. You can have your driver's license, you can have a student card, you can have an employee card, but in this case, you may have to show your identities that is provided to you by the military base or by the military units, right? So once verified that your identity information is valid, basically verify that you are who you say you are, then most likely the security guard will give you a access card. Right? So let's use this as an example. Let's say this is an access card. So you will have a access card in your hand. So let's combine this together, right? So you now have a access card. And this access card contains, again, your identity informations, as well as some of the other information may be including expiry date, right? So you may only have access to this military base for a limited period of time. So then you go into the gate. Now, if you want to go into any of the buildings, you cannot just walk in and we'll check your internal identity card, this card that just was given to you, to verify that you have the permission to go into each one of these buildings, right? Because each different building may have different requirements. You have to be perhaps above a certain rank, or you have to be one of the managers of this building. Then it will allow you to go in. And when the access card expires, you would have to go out of this facility, right? Well, you have to return your card. So within this process, we have three concepts here. So the first process here is that when the security guard verifies your identity and give you an internal access card, this is a process of authentication, right? To verify that you are who you say you are, right? And then provide you with this internal access card. And this internal access card is what we call the security context, right? The security context that contains all of the information about you, so that when you carry this security context to any of these buildings, it will then apply certain requirements to your security context, right? Verify that your security context contains enough permissions to satisfy the requirements to enter the building, right? So, and this process is called authorization, right? Authorization is the process of verifying that your identities are satisfying the requirements of entering or accessing the building. And similarly, in a web application, imagine these are the different pages, and you have this login page here that is trying to, like the security guard is asking you to log in, right? The process of logging in, which is providing the username and password and verify the username and password, that is called authentication, right? And authentication also provides you the security context, right? If it's cookie authentication, then it generates the cookie, right? And if it's token authentication, then it generates the token. So you have the cookie, either the cookie or the token or something else that contains your security context. And then the subsequent request going into the page, different pages will carry the security context, either this cookie or token, until that security context expires, and then it will lose your access to the entire web application, right? And when you access each one of these pages, each page may have different requirements, right? So, and that's the authorization comes in, right? The authorization process will look at your security context and then applies those requirements toward that security context to see whether your security context
actually satisfies the requirements of accessing the page. If it does, then it will allow you to access the page. If not, then it will return HTTP 403 error to indicate that although you have logged in, but you don't have access to this page, right? And if you cannot even log in, then it will actually return HTTP 401 saying you're not authenticated. In the previous video, I covered a little bit about security in web application. In this video, I want to cover still on high level, but I want to provide a little bit more detail in terms of the flow. So if we have a user here trying to access a web page, right? Let's imagine this login page is already loaded because the user wants to access some information that requires login, right? So the user would interact with this browser to enter the credentials, right? So once the credential is entered, a HTTP request and then is sent to the server, right? So let's use this arrow to represent the HTTP request that is sent to the server. When the server receives the credentials from the HTTP request body, it's going to then verify against a user store to make sure the credentials are correct. Why do I draw a database symbol here? That's because the user information is stored usually in the data store, right? So the credentials need to be verified against the user's data store, right? So this step will happen. And if the verification is completed correctly, that means the credentials are correct. The identity will come back. The identity information will be used to generate the security context. So let's use this rectangle to represent this verification process. Verify credentials. And then we're going to use this second rectangle to represent the process of generating the security context. So after the verification, the identities will be pulled into the web server and store those identities in the security context and then serialize that into a cookie. If you're not very familiar with the concept of cookie, I just want to add a little bit information here. A cookie can be considered as a piece of information that is stored in the header of the HTTP request and HTTP response. Right? That information is going to be carried back and forth between the browser and the web server. And there is a feature with this piece of information because in the header you can contain lots of information, but the cookie is a special type of information because it can only be shared within the same domain, right? You cannot send a request to a different web server that carries the same cookie because there is a security problem. All right, let's go back to this authentication and authorization flow. So let's imagine this is a normal cookie authentication, which is very suitable for this web application, right? So then this serialized cookie will be contained in the HTTP response and then will be returned back to the browser. The browser will then redirect the user to a different page, right? And including that redirection, every single subsequent HTTP request will contain that cookie, right? So let's use another arrow to represent one of the subsequent requests, and then this rectangle will represent the authentication process. So you may ask why this is authentication where this is already the verification process is already authentication, right? So yes, this whole part here, both of these rectangles are part of authentication, right? To verify the user is who they say they are, and then generate the security context, serialize that into a cookie, sends that back to the browser. So this is all authentication process. Why do we have this authentication process again? Well, here we have it in the cookie, right? We have the security context in the cookie. The web server will have to deserialize that into the security context, and then the web server will actually know whether the user is actually logged in or not, right? So this part of deserializing the security context from the cookie is also part of authentication, right? So basically in one statement, authentication is the process to know who you are, right? So because the security context is already stored in the cookie, so in order to know at this step, in order to know who you are, it only needs to decrypt that cookie and deserialize that cookie because the cookie is encrypted. So once those happens, immediately we know whether the user is authenticated or not. So this is still the authentication process where we decrypt the cookie, we deserialize the cookie to get the security context. And then once we have the security context, which is actually contained in the HTTP context object, right? Once we have that information, then we can tell whether the user is authorized to access the information or the page it wants to see, right? So that's the second step, which is authorization, right? So authorization will happen right afterwards. And then if everything is okay, then the web server will decide to return the proper response that contains the HTML and all of the data that the user requires. From this video, I wanted to show you that both these steps as well as these are part of authentication, and then the authorization process is relatively simpler from at least conceptual level. In this video, I want to quickly cover the basics of ASP.NET Core, including the middleware pipeline and the filter pipeline. I would expect you have experiences with ASP.NET Core already, but I still want to quickly cover the basics just in case you need a recap. So ASP.NET Core is a platform for creating web applications that includes web APIs as well. So web applications are based on HTTP request, right? So you would have your front end and your backend, right? So you have your front end browser and your backend server. So the front end browser and the backend server is sending HTTP request back and forth, right? So the HTTP request contains a lot of information, right? It can contain information in the URL, can contain information in the HTTP header, as well as body, and other places. The request and response are basically just contains pieces of information that needs to be passed back and forth between the front end and the back end, right? The browser and the server, right? So let's zoom into the server, right? So let's imagine this part is the server, and because we want to zoom in, so we want to make it bigger. So inside this server, we have a place where we need to process the request, right? You can have one function, for example, to process the request right here, right? Just process. And then the request is processed, the response is generated and sent back to the server. The user will see the HTML, right? So that's okay, but the process itself has many steps, right? Like authentication, authorization, exception handlings, logging, routing, and validations. All those steps need to be performed, right? If you couple everything together, that go against a lot of software design and architecture rules, principles. So in order to process this in a proper way, we can apply some software design patterns, and one of the software design patterns is this is so-called the chain of responsibilities, right? So then we would have many functions instead of one function. We can have many functions here, right? let's say, just call it function 1, function 3, and function n, right? So all of these can be connected together. So what this connection means is that this message will be handed to the function, for the first function, and the first function will process it, do something to that message, right? Kind of mutate that message, and then pass that message to the second one to process the message and change that message, right? And then pass on to the last one, and then return that message back, still process it afterwards, still process it and pass it all the way, and then generate the final HTTP response and send that back to the browser. And by the way, the message that I'm referring to is the HTTP context object that encapsulate both the HTTP request and the HTTP response. So this is what we call the middleware pipeline, right? This middleware pipeline kind of separates, kind of does the separation of concerns. Each middleware in the pipeline takes different responsibilities. Whereas usually the last one that are responsible to process the business logic here has its own pipeline, right? Because these are for cross-cutting concerns like exception handlings, loggings, right? Authentication, authorization, partially authorization. And then here, according to each different request, we process them differently, and therefore, we should have another pipeline that will, according to the different requests, will process it differently, right? The second pipeline here are not handling cross-cutting concerns, but handling specific concerns for the specific request. So you would have different filters here instead of different middlewares there, right? So these functions are basically middlewares, right? So here then you would have filter 1, filter 2. I'm not writing it anymore, right? Filter 3, for example. So your request, your message will be also going through all of these. So here I want to emphasize this may not go in one by one. It may go through the first one and then go around, and then going back may not go through each one of them. It may go around. Whereas in middleware, it will go like that. But anyway, this filter pipeline has many filters connected together, and these are for handling specific requests, whereas these are for handling cross-cutting concerns. So this is the basics of ASP.NET Core, right? And once I go into coding very, very quickly in the next few videos, I will share coding, and these concepts are important to know before that. Another very important concept to understand before I actually start coding and show you how security identity actually works within ASP.NET Core is this security context. Right, so what is actually the security context? The security context contains all the information that the user has for security purpose. That includes the user information itself, username, and all of the other type of user information like email addresses, right? Those informations are actually encapsulated within one single object that is called claims principal. In ASP.NET Core, we're using claims principal, so that's why I mentioned claims principal, but it's actually, we can say that on a conceptual level, we have a principal object that represents this security context of the user, right? It's basically, you can consider this is the user, right? And the principal contains one or many identities of the user. Why there can be many type of identities? I think I have explained in the first video that one person can have many type of identities, right? You can, for example, you can be a student and you have a student card. You can be an employee and you have your employee card, and you can have your driver's license, and you can have the access card to your apartment building. So all of these are a form of identity. And then the next level is claims. So one identity then can contain many claims. Okay? What are claims? Claims are basically a key value pair that carries your information. For example, on your driver's license. For example, this identity is your driver's license identity, right? Driver's license. And you can see that on driver's license, there is your name, right? For example, my name. And then you may have your birthday, right? Whatever your birthday is. And then you could have your height, whether you need to wear glasses where you're driving. Driver's license also contains my eye color, and as well as my address. Right, so all of these are claims. These are just examples of claims. Of course, this one claim is just one key and pair. One key pair, right? So if you want driver's license to contain all of these, then it would be like this, right? So these are the relationship between principals, identities, and claims. Again, the principal represents the logged in user. It contains all of the information that the logged in user has. And then the principal can have many identities. Usually we have just one identity, which is the default identity. And then one identity can have many claims, which carries all of the user information. And then eventually when we're doing authorization, we can use these claims. We can apply those requirements on each page or resource in our web server, right? Those requirements that requires certain claims to be present in order to gain access to the resource. Let's jump right into Visual Studio and start digging deep under the hood to understand ASP.NET Core security. So I'm using Visual Studio 2019 Community Edition, and I'm about to create a ASP.NET Core web application, right? You can come over here and do web app, right? Search web app, and then you can see ASP.NET Core web application, click on next. And so you basically enter your locations, project name, and solution name, and then click on create. And what we are going to create is a ASP.NET Core web app. So this is going to be the Blazor Pages application. This is not going to be model view controller because right now Microsoft considers the Blazor Pages solution as the primary solution. That's why in this course, I am using the Blazor Pages solution. So then without creating any authentication, let's click on the create, and then we can start from scratch without using any default setup for authentication, so that we can understand the security, the identity aspects of ASP.NET Core completely. So I'm clicking on the create button. So now we have the application created. This is the intermediate course. I'm not going to go about and show you which file is what and how they all work together. I'm going to come to this diagram, and we'll follow this diagram back and forth along these lines so that we can investigate each and every single step. So first of all, we don't have a login page, right? But we do have other pages where we're going to send requests and receive a response. So let's examine this part first, because this part carries all of our security context. So this is the first part we're going to examine. So we have a index page, right? And we don't have any protection on the page, so we should be able to just run without any problems. All right, so this page is loaded, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to set a breakpoint, and then I'm going back to the page. I'm going to refresh the page. Now my breakpoint is triggered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add something to look at. I'm going to examine the information under the page model of the Blazor pages, which contains the data construct for Blazor pages, which is pretty similar to MVC's data construct. And if we say base dot, and we can see all of the data construct, and one of them is user. And if you look closely, you can see that this is the claims principle, which is the security context that I talked about in the previous video. The security context is under the user, right? Because it is the user principle. So then what is under there? And you can see that the principles can contain a list of identities. Currently, it only has one. And this is the primary identity. This identity is the primary identity, which is sort of like in the first video when I talked about when you go into the military facility, as a person, you have many type of identities. You have your driver's license, you can have your employee card, you can have your student card, you can have everything. You can even have a library card, right? But the identity that is the primary identity is supposed to be the one that is provided to you by the military, right? So this identity is our primary identity that our ASP.NET Core currently is working with, right? So if we go to that, and we do dot identity, and then we can see that it has different informations here. The main information is claims, which doesn't have anything. And the reason is that this current identity is a anonymous identity. You can see that this is authenticated member is currently false. Why is it anonymous identity? Because I haven't logged in yet. I didn't touch any login page. In fact, we don't have a login page. So in this case, we're actually logging in, quote unquote, to this web application without any identity. And this is still considered as a identity, and this identity is the anonymous identity, and that's why the is authenticated is false. So in other words, whether you logged in or not logged in, once the HTTP request goes into ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core creates the primary identity for you, right? Regardless whether you logged in or not. And if you logged in, then it will contain all of your security context, right? If it doesn't log in, it will contain a anonymous identity, which is still a security context, but it's an anonymous one. So this is the concept I would like you to understand, that regardless whether you logged in or not, you have a security context, you have a primary identity under your security context. Since in the last video, we have learned about the anonymous identity inside the HTTP context object. In this video, we're going to create a login page so that we can have an actual login identity instead of anonymous one. So let's jump into Visual Studio and continue from what we have created from the previous video. So since this is a Blazor's page solution, we are going to create a subfolder under here. And let's call it account, and then we're going to create a login page. So we are not going to scaffold from identity framework inside ASP.NET Core. We're going to create our own login page, and then we can learn about what exactly is happening under the hood instead of just using the scaffolding. Okay, let's create a empty Blazor page, and let's call it login. All right. So we have the CS/HTML page here, and then we have this page behind here, right? So this is actually based on MVC framework, but it gives you a MVVM field, right? It's instead of MVC, it gives you MVVM field. So because of that, the first thing we need to create is a model that you can use to communicate between the front and the back, right? And let's call that model a credential model, right? So we haven't created yet, but that's okay. We can create it right now. And let's just call it credential, right? So this is not created, and that's fine. We're going to create it right under here. And we can create a public class, and let's call it credential. And we are going to have a username and of course a password. All right, so this class will be used as a model to communicate between the front and the back, right? The reader pages and the page model here. And of course, we can add some validation here. And this one, we can make it required field. And of course, here, we're going to do control dot to import the namespace. And same over here, we're going to make it a required. And make this a password data type. And then what we need to do is we're going to make this a bind property so that it gives you a feeling of two-way data binding. All right, so with this property set up, we can go to the, and then we can just enter the HTML that we want to use. Right, so by default, solution comes with Bootstrap. In the layout.cs HTML, you can see Bootstrap is here. So we can enter some Bootstrap classes. Right, so this is going to be a container, and we want to have a border so that it looks better, right? And then we're gonna add a little bit of padding, right? So we have a div here, and then we need a form, right? And this is going to be a post form, allowing you to post. We're gonna have 2 rows, right? And this is going to be a form group. And this is row number 1. And then inside the row, we have 2 columns, right? The first column is for the label. The second one is going to be for, let's change it to 5. So right, this one is a narrower column, and this is a wider column, right? So this is going to be for the label. So before we do that, I can, well, let's enter a label here. And this is going to be bound to that credential, to this credential field, right? So we're gonna call this, so this will be bound to that, and this is the way we do it with tag helper. And then we'll do input, and this is going to be a text for sure, and to be bound to the same field, right? So this is the actual binding, but this one gives you the label name. And then we're gonna copy this, and then of course this one is going to be bound to the password field, and the input is also bound to the password field. So let's run it and see. Let me do Control F5. Okay, so in order to navigate to it, in reader pages is based on folder by default, so we don't have to specify attribute in order to navigate to it. So we're just basically doing the folder name, right, and then the page name. So we have it. And I don't like the label to be too big, so let's actually change that to, instead of 3, let's change that to 2. And this, we'll add a form control to make it look better. Same as this. Forgot to add the class. CSS class. Okay, going over here, I'm gonna do a refresh. Okay, so apparently we need a submit button, and for that we are basically just doing this and deleting this, and I'm going to keep my input button here. So this is going to be a submit button, okay, and then this is going to be a primary button, and then the label is login. All right, so let's refresh the page. Okay, so we have a login button here. If I click on this button, it does a post back. You can see it does a post back. So this is not exactly what we want, right? Because you have to really enter your username and password. This is not doing the validation. We need to make sure that it validates, right? And in reader pages, to do that, it's very simple. First, on the top within the form, we're gonna add a div. The class would be gender, right? And then it's going to be for validation, right? We're going to use tag helper validation summary, and then we'll say model only, right? So this is going to be validating our model, which is the credential field. And then for each field, right, we are going to add a span. And again, we're going to say text danger for the CSS class, and it's validation, and it's going to be validating this field, right? So you can see with the tag helper, both the model binding as well as validation is very simple. Refresh the page, and then now you can see that the validation is displayed. Let's say our username is admin and our password is going to be password. Of course, you can see this field is not playing very nicely. It's showing my password. So we need to fix that problem, and we come back to this login.cs HTML, and we're going to change this instead of text. So this part has to be a password. So you're going to refresh this page, and then password is password. Now it's doing correctly, right? So once we click on this, this credentials has to be sent to here, to be bound here. So, but then how do we receive the postback event? And that's when we are doing on post, right? So this is by convention. So let's do a debug here. We're gonna run debug, and then we navigate to our login page. So if type in our password, and then going over here, if we watch this .credential, we can see that the username and password is actually received. So this is kind of a two-way data binding. A feeling of two-way data binding, at least, although I only demonstrated the one-way data binding, which is binding from the UI to our page behind, right? So we can do the other. Although it doesn't make sense, but we can definitely do the other one, which is, so we're gonna have the credential, we're gonna initialize the credential, right? And then we can have at least we can populate the username. And then when we're doing this, right? So when the page is requested, the login page is requested, this get handler is going to be executed. When it's posted back, this post handler is going to be executed. So when this get handler is executed, we populate our model, and then this information will be used inside the view here. Okay, so let's run that and see that is really a feeling of two-way data binding. It's really a feeling of MVVM, although this is all based on MVC. I know this is kind of outside the security course, since you should have already known this, but Razor pages haven't been around for too long. That's why I wanted to cover just a little bit. So you can see that the admin is populated here. So this is from our page model to the UI. And then we set a breakpoint here. So once we submit the form, then we would receive our credential from the UI to the page model, right? So this is two-way data binding. And of course, we don't need the username to be pre-populated. And another thing is this username is not displayed correctly. It's displayed as one word. So when we display it, we want it to be displayed as separate word. So we can provide that over here. Okay, so once we have that, then we refresh the page and we can see that the username is separated. So next step is that we need to verify the credentials inside the onPost, and then we need to generate the security context, which is the claims principle. So we'll do that in the next video. Now that we have implemented a login page, and we have also covered where the security context is stored, we're ready to implement the verifications of credentials as well as generating the security context. So let's jump into Visual Studio and start implementing those logic. So first of all, we need to make sure that we do have our credentials. And for that, we need to check our model state to see whether it's valid or not. And if it's not valid, we are going to return. And then next, we want to verify the credentials. And we are not going to connect to the database. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the security aspect of that. So that's why we're just hard-coding the verification process here. So I want to make sure that the username is admin and the password is password. So as long as we have these two match the username and password, then we're okay. The next step, right? So here we verify the credential, right? And then the second step here, we are creating the security context, right? And if we go back to our diagram that we drew before, we will need to create a bunch of claims, and then we add to the identity. We only need one identity, which is the primary identity. Once we have the primary identity, we add it to the claims principal, and we are done with creating the security context, right? So for that, we'll instantiate a list of claims. And I'm doing Control Dot to import the namespace here. And then of course, we are going to add, let's add some claims here. Right, so we're gonna have a name, and let's call it just admin, and perhaps we'll add another one. We'll add another claim, and let's see what options do we have here. Do we have an email? Yeah, we have an email. Let's say admin at mywebsite.com. Right, that's good enough. Now that we have the claims, you know, we have mentioned the claims are just a pair of attributes, right? And with that, we need to add those claims to a identity. So now we need to declare and instantiate the identity. And what we need is a claims identity, which we can add the claims to it. And then here, what we want to have is the authentication type. The authentication type. Let's give it a name, and then I'm going to talk about this later, right? So we're going to use cookie authentication, which is the typical type of authentication for a login page, right? Let's call it my cookie, like my cookie authentication, right? And you can give it whatever name you want. So once we have the identity, then what we need is a claims principal. I mean, to instantiate that, and it can be empty, but you can also provide a primary identity. You can also provide this primary identity here. So now we have this security context within the claims principal, right? We have learned that the principal contains the security context. Now, what we need to do, we can see that we generate the security context, but then next step is we need to encrypt and serialize the security context, and then it can go into the cookie, right? But we don't need to do that ourselves. We can use the HTTP context object. It has a sign in async method here, which is an extension method. You can see it's an extension method. It comes from the ASP.NET Core HTTP namespace, right? So we can do that. And here, we also want to specify the authentication scheme, which is the authentication type. And we want this authentication type to be exactly the same as this one, right? And then here we can provide the principal as the second parameter, right? So we're going to put in the claims principal here. Since this is async, right? So we need to await it. And because of that, what we need to do is we'll change this to a task, and it has to be an async task. And because of that, we'll also make this one async. So this one is supposed to, what it does is that it's going to serialize the claims principal into a string and then encrypt that string, save that as a cookie in the HTTP context, right, into the cookie inside HTTP context object. And if everything is good, then we're going to redirect to a page. So let's just redirect to the index page, right? You can see that this redirect to a page, it actually returns the redirect to page result. So because of that, we are going to, instead of making this a void, we're going to make it return iAction result. Of course, here, what we can do here, we have to fix it. We can return the page result here. So what's going to happen here is that it's going to basically return the view, right? So this one is going to find the index view and return the index view, right? When we return the page result, we're returning the login.cs HTML, right? Which is the CS HTML object. And if the verification failed, then it will fall out of this branch. And again, we're going to return a page, okay? So let's build this solution and then let's run it, right? So because we did not configure authorization, that's why I did not redirect us to the login page directly, but we can go to the login page, right? And then we can type in the password. And if I type in something that is wrong, so it will return directly back to the login page, which is this one, right? But if I input the correct password, then watch what happens. It throws exception. So let's look into this exception. See, it says that no sign-in authentication handlers are registered. Did you forget to call the @authentication @cookie? It tells you exactly what you need to do here. But before we actually do this, let's try to understand what is actually happening here. Right? It says that on this line, there's something is wrong. So what exactly is wrong here, right? Let's read this error message again. It says there's no sign-in authentication handlers. Authentication handlers. So this is the keyword, authentication handlers, right? So what is actually happening is that this HTTP context sign-in async, under the hood, it uses the authentication handler, which is provided to this through the Authentication Service interface. Okay, so let's take a look at the Authentication Service interface. See, this interface contains the abstraction of several methods, right? There is this sign-in async, which is exactly the one that we're missing, right? It contains sign out, challenge, forbid, and authenticate. So these are the abstractions of the authentication handlers, right? So what is complaining here is that the HTTP context.sign-in async is trying to use the Authentication Service interface, but it cannot find any concrete implementation of that interface. So we are missing, we don't have the handlers here. And it asks you to inject, right? So this is the dependency injection under the configure services, right? It asks you to inject the implementation of those handlers. Let's take a step back and see what is actually happening here as from the design pattern point of view. Right? So let's see this, let's use this printf in the C language, for example, right? Usually this printf will print to the console, to your screen. So this is the output. The printf will output to the console. But if you use different libraries, it can go to the console, right? It can also go to, let's say, a printer, right? It can go to any other I/O devices. What is actually happening under the hood is that the printf is not talking to these devices directly. What it's actually talking to is an abstraction of the I/O devices. In C++, this would be an abstract class. So these drivers implement the abstraction, And then as long as you import the libraries of the corresponding drivers, then you are able to print to a console or printer or other devices, right? So what this printf is really talking to is this abstraction. So this kind of design pattern, this kind of design pattern is basically it's everywhere. It's typically when you have some I/O devices. You don't want to lock your library to a particular output device, right? You don't want to, for example, you don't want to lock your output to just SQL Server database, right? By locking to a specific SQL Server database library. You want to talk to an interface, and then develop all of these as plugins. So in our case, it's the same situation here. We are having a bunch of authentication and authorization. In this case, we're talking about authentication, right? We're having some requirements for authentication, and it needs to serialize the information, right? The security context to either a cookie or a token or something else. They are kind of like a I/O thing. It's outside the application boundary. It's under the HTTP protocol, right? So the security context can be stored or can be serialized to either a cookie or a token or something else. You don't want to lock yourself to just a cookie or just a token like this, right? You don't want to directly talk to it. So what you actually want to do is you want to do a similar thing, right? So inside your application, right? So let's use this this square or rectangle as a boundary for your application. Inside it, you want to talk to a abstraction, right? And this is the Authentication Service. This interface in C#, it contains the abstraction of all of your needs for authentication, right? So your actual authentication will just talk to this abstraction, and then the cookies or tokens, the different authentication handlers, as long as it implements this authentication service, then the only thing as a developer what you need to do is to tell the ASP.NET Core that either you want a cookie authentication handler to be injected, or a token authentication handler to be injected, or both, right? Or both. And that's where the authentication scheme name or the authentication type name come into play, right? That name comes into play because it can be this or this, right? Cookie or token or both. Because there can be multiple authentication handlers that implements the authentication service, we want to give them different names so that we can distinguish, right? ASP.NET Core can distinguish which is which. We can use the name to group the cookie, the security context, which is the principal entities, and the authentication handler itself together. And that's why we need to specify the name everywhere. And what is that name? That is the authentication scheme or the authentication type, which you have seen when I was implementing it. So let's jump into Visual Studio and see how we implement these, right? And it's actually very clear here. It's actually telling you, you need to add authentication. You need to do this. So let's copy this and let's stop debugging and let's go into our startup where we can find this server configure services. This is where we want to inject our authentication handler. So over here, what we want to do is, I'm gonna paste this over here, right? So we're gonna do this services.add. So basically we're adding services to a collection. You can see this is a service collection interface here, right? We're adding this authentication handler to the service collection, and this add cookie is adding the cookie authentication handler, right? This means that all of the implementations for encrypting and serializing the security context will be injected into ASP.NET Core by just calling this extension method, which is implemented by ASP.NET Core, right? So we don't have to specifically implement how this encryption, decryption, serializing, deserializing works. We just need to add this cookie authentication handler. All we have to be really taking care of is to give it a name, right? We can give our own name. We can, yeah, it's just a string, right? So, and then here, let's take a look at the second parameter here, which is the options. So we want to also make sure we configure our options correctly here. And in here, there's a lot of different things we can configure, right? But at this moment, the most important thing is that we need to configure our cookie, and especially our cookie name. We want this to be just like that. So this specifies the cookie name, which is the most important aspect in the cookie authentication. By doing so, you specify target of the serialization, and ASP.NET Core knows which cookie contains the authentication security context. Okay, so let's, at this moment, only configure the cookie name here. And then we can see that we have been very careful of using the same name, right, in the cookie name, in the authentication scheme name, as well as in the identity. Associate this cookie name with the identity and provide this cookie or the authentication scheme name to the sign-in, where they are all the same name, so that we can kind of logically group them together. Of course, the best practice here is to declare a constant. Right? I'm not going to do that. When we actually implement a solution, we should actually declare a constant for this, in case we have some typos. All right, so let's run the solution again. Okay, I'm going to bring up the developer tool, right, by pressing F12. And then I'm going to go to, right, clicking on this double arrow, and then I go to applications. I want to look at the cookies, right? So go under cookies, right? Open this up, and then go into this domain, right? Cookies are always associated with specific domains. So we're looking at this domain. So that's why we have to go under this domain. And we can see that we don't have my cookie auth, the cookie name. We only have this by default. We have this anti-forgery a cookie here, right? So we don't have our cookie yet, but let's watch what's happening here. So let's go into provide the correct username and password, and then let's watch whether we're gonna have a cookie or not. All right. So you can see that we have a cookie, right? We have a cookie, so this is all encrypted, right, and serialized. So this contains our security context, which is the claims principle. But we can't see anything because it's really encrypted within this domain. And where does the cookie come from? That comes from here. So this HTTP context.sign async is triggered, and it talks to the Authentication Service interface. And who has implemented that interface? That what we have chosen to inject into our ASP.NET Core by calling add cookie. So this cookie authentication handler is injected, and we have configured to take this authentication scheme name, right? And we made sure we're using the same authentication scheme name. We grouped them all together. And so that when we trigger this method, it uses the cookie authentication handler that we have injected into ASP.NET Core, taking this name. And finally, we can see that claim principal security context is created over here, taking the cookie name. Okay, so let's recap. What we have done today is we input username and password. We implemented this verification process, and we implemented the generating process, right? We generate the security context within the claims principle. We injected the cookie authentication handlers, right? And we successfully created the cookie. So the cookie is now sent back to the browser. We saw that in the browser developer tool. So in the next video, we are going to follow this line to see whether we have the cookie deserialized and decrypted. I'll see you in the next one. So in the previous video, we verified the credential here, and then we generated the security context. We serialized the security context into a cookie and sent that cookie back to the browser, right? We could see the cookie in the browser developer tool, and it looks like this. It is encrypted. In this video, let's follow this arrow to look into what this authentication does and how it does it. So I'm already from the login page redirected back to the index page, right? So let's set a breakpoint at the get handler of the index page, right? So let's set a breakpoint right here, and then we'll see what happens. I'm going to refresh the page, and then this is triggered. So let's watch what do we have for the user. And we can see that we have one identity, which is the claims identity. Unfortunately, it is still an anonymous identity, but we have already logged in. We have successfully generated a cookie. Why on earth this primary identity is still an anonymous identity? So let's go back to our diagrams right over here, and we'll see that what is really going on here. Okay, so the browser does have the cookie. And then when the browser sends another request to the index page, right, the cookie is definitely sent to the server, right? But the fact that we still see anonymous identity, it means the server didn't look at the cookie, right? So what is responsible to look at the cookie? Okay, so that's related to the middleware. So this is the browser, right? So the browser sends request into ASP.NET Core, right? What is responsible for processing the request? It's those middlewares that are hooked together, right? And the request is actually encapsulated in one object, which is the HTTP context object, right? That is the object we were looking at when we were checking, we were watching here. So we were watching this base.user, right? But it's actually from the HTTP context. So if we do HTTP context, we would see the same thing, okay? And this user would also have the primary identity, and it still is unauthenticated, is false, right? So we know that along these lines, the request actually is within the HTTP context. So there's got to be a middleware who's going to look into the HTTP header within the HTTP context and then populate the security context with the corresponding values. So, and that middleware is our authentication middleware, right? So when the authentication middleware is looking at the HTTP request within the HTTP context, it should be able to see the header that contains the cookie, and then it will interpret that cookie, and after the processing, it will populate the security context, right? The claims principle with the values translated from the cookie. So that's the job for the authentication middleware to do. The reason why the primary identity is still the anonymous identity, that's because we didn't set up our authentication middleware, right? The authentication middleware is missing. That's why it's still the anonymous one. So now what we need to do is very simple. We just need to insert the authentication middleware in the pipeline. And to do that, let's go to our startup.cs file. Let's stop our debugging. And then we go to configure method. And over here, above this authorization middleware, you need to say use authentication, right? So this basically inserted the authentication middleware, which is responsible to call the authentication handler, right? So if we look at our Authentication Service interface, we can see that this authenticate async, right? We can see this is the one, right? So authenticate for the specific authentication. So this one is going to be called, and this method is going to be called, and it's supposed to be able to translate all of the cookie into the security context, the claims principle. All right, so let's see once we added this, what is going to happen. So everything that this middleware needs is already injected with these 4 lines of code. Right, so this we have injected the Authentication Service, which contains the cookie authentication handlers, right? And that's why it's able to convert the cookie into our claims principal, because we have already injected our cookie authentication service, right? The cookie authentication handlers. All right, so let's run a debug again and see whether it's going to work this time. Okay, so let's go to our login page. Okay, we haven't set up our authorization yet, so I have to manually go to our login page. Okay, so we have logged in, and then if we refresh that page and then we watch the this one, we could see the primary identity, and then we notice that this is authenticated property is still false. So what is going on? We have already put the middleware there. Why it's not interpreting the cookie correctly? Well, we know that what is actually interpreting the cookie is the authentication handler or the service that we injected into our pipeline, right? And that is this cookie authentication service that we have already did it. But we also know that there could be multiple authentication service that are injected, right? You can use multiple different cookies authentication handler with different names. You can have cookie, you can have token. Although we have inserted the middleware in the pipeline, it does not know which scheme you want to use, right? The scheme name, it provides a logical grouping that groups your authentication handlers, your identities, your claims principles all together, right? You have to tell the middleware which scheme you are trying to use so that the middleware is able to locate which authentication service you are trying to use to do the authentication. All right, so the way to do that is actually pretty simple. So we have to provide a authentication scheme name in here to tell the authentication middleware which authentication scheme we wanted to use to do the authentication. So it's the same name as the authentication service. It's my cookie auth. So let's give that a try. All right, so we input our password. And then now we arrive at our breakpoint again. You can see the base.user contains the identity, and this time the identity is authenticated. And we can also see the claims that we added over here, which is, the name is admin, and the email address is admin@mywebsite.com. All right, finally, we're able to translate the cookie into our security context. Having said all of this, it's actually really simple, right? The reason why I included so many details here is to really try to make you understand exactly what is happening here, that we need a middleware in order to do the authentication, and the middleware uses the injected cookie authentication handler. But because there could be multiple different authentication handlers, you have to specify which is the one that should be used in the middleware, right? By specifying the name here, right? You can add multiple of these, but there can be only one that is used to do the authentication, and you just have to specify the name. In this case, we only have one, right? So all of these names are the same, including the name in here, right? For the identities and for sending the cookie. All right, so that's everything in this video. I'll see you in the next one. In this video, let's learn about how authorization works in the ASP.NET Core. So if you have a browser here and you input a URL in the browser and you want to access a certain endpoint or a certain page, on the server. So let's say we have page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. Different pages may have different requirements for accessing the page, right? For example, page 1 could be allowing anonymous users to access, whereas page 2 could be a admin-only page. And maybe page 3 will only allow people from the HR department. And page 4 may be looking at, you have to be a admin, and also you have to from the HR department, right? It's a combination of these two. And maybe you have page 5 where you have for example, a online casino page where you have to be older than 18 years old, right? So there's all different kinds of requirements on different pages or different endpoints we're talking about web API. So these requirements have to be satisfied in order for the user to access these pages, right? We know that when a request is sent to SPDNet Core server, it goes through a pipeline. After it goes through the Authentication Middleware, we know the security context, which contains the identity of the user, and identity contains a set of claims, right? And it's going to tell us whether the user is an admin user, which department the user comes from, what is the age of the user. So all of the information are contained in the claims. And of course, before the authentication middleware comes in, this routing middleware that tell us which endpoint it's trying to navigate to. And then the authentication middleware will be able to deserialize the cookie into our security context, the claims principals, identities, as well as claims, right? Then at this point, we know, for example, we're trying to hit page 2. Who's going to check the requirement? That's the authorization middleware. Okay, so the authorization middleware is the middleware that will look at the claims from the user and then look at the requirements from the page and then compare them and make sure that the claims satisfy the requirement. And if that's the case, then it will allow the user to access the page. Otherwise, it will return HTTP 4.3, right, which is a challenge, right? You don't have the permission to access the page, although you're logged in. So that's how authorization works on higher level. But the question is, what are those requirements? In ASP.NET Core, we actually have requirement classes, and then we can group different requirements together, form a policy. So we would have a policy, and one policy can have one or many requirements. Let's use 2, for example. So we can define these policies in the configure services method within the startup.cs file, which I'll show you later. Right, we can define these policies, and then we can apply these policies by using the authorized attribute on the appropriate pages, which I'll also demonstrate later in the next video. In this video, I just want to give you an overview of the architecture of how authorization works. Right? So we can define a policy which contains a bunch of requirements. So these requirements are pretty simple. The presence of the admin claim is there, then we're okay, right? If the department claim has a HR value, then we allow the user to access page 3, right? And this is basically a simple combination of 2 claims. As long as they're there, then we allow access to it. But then it comes to this, there is a comparison. How does the authorization middleware be able to handle this type of requirement checking? Well, we have to create custom requirement ourselves, and we have to implement the logic of handling those requirements. As a matter of fact, in ASP.NET Core, for each requirement, there has to be a corresponding authorization handler to handle those requirements, right? So basically, the authorization middleware uses something that is called Authorization Service, just like the authentication middleware uses the Authentication Service, right? And then the implementation of the Authorization Service will look through all of the requirements, right, and find corresponding handlers to handle each requirement. Actually, each requirement must have a corresponding handler. For checking the presence of the claims, there's generic ones to do the job, but if you come up with a particular requirement that needs particular logic, then you have to implement your own requirement. Let's say requirement 1 is contains a specific logic. You have to implement that authentication handler yourself by creating a class and derive that class from authorization handler to handle this requirement, right? So in this case, the policy is applied to a certain page, right, which contains a custom requirement, requirement 1, and then we have a requirement 1 authorization handler to check the requirement, and then the authorization service will be invoked by the authorization middleware, and this completes the authorization requirement checking. Once it's complete, it's going to either grant you the access to the page or deny you from accessing the page. Just to recap, after writing an authorization, we know which endpoint we're trying to hit, like which page we're trying to hit, and we have all of the claims, and then the authorization middleware will be able to check what is the requirement. It uses authorization service, requirement handler in order to check whether the logged in user satisfies the requirement for this endpoint. Because it has the identity of the login user, it has all of the claims of the user, then the authorization handler will be able to look at the claims and the requirement and then compare them and implement any type of logic that it needs to, right? The generic authorization handler is enough to handle those simple scenarios where you just say, I want this user to be admin, right? There's no logic, just checking the presence of the claim or checking the value of the claim, of a certain claim. So those ones can be handled by generic authorization handler. But for specific ones with specific logics, you can implement a handler yourself. And this is the whole flow and the architecture of authorization. I hope it helps. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. If not, I'll see you in the next video where we're going to implement authorization. In this video, we're going to learn about how to implement authorization in the ASP.NET Core. So we have gone through this diagram in the previous video, and we know that the first step we need to do is to apply a requirement. The simplest requirement we can apply to a page is to deny anonymous users. And to do that is very simple. Let's go to a page. And in our case, we have a index page, right? And we can deny anonymous access on the index page. And we can just simply go to the page behind here. And then we go to the class. We decorate it with the Authorize attribute, which simply denies anonymous identity. So I'm going to import the namespace. And now let's see what's going to happen if we run our application. So of course, the first page it's trying to hit is the index page. But because our index page is protected, right? So it automatically redirects us to account login, the login page, right? With the return URL to be nothing. It's empty. If you happen to see the next page, it could mean that you had your cookie here, that you didn't clear the cookie, right? It's because we haven't implemented the sign out functionality. And if you didn't close your browser, so your browser session will still keep that cookie inside the browser. So once you clear the cookie, you should be able to see your login page. But what happens is really, we have our authorization middleware after the routing, it is seeing that you try to hit a page that needs identities, but it's not there. So it returns a HTTP 401 challenge, right? It's a challenge which automatically redirected you to login page. The reason why it knows where your login page is that by default, the login page is supposed to be placed in the account folder and it's supposed to be called login, right? The page is supposed to be called login. It happens to be the case that we followed the convention, right? So if we change, just temporarily, we change the folder to account 1. And then if we run our application again, well, let's see what happens. Now it's trying to still look for the login page, but then it says HTTP 404. Okay, so to explicitly specify where your login page is, you need to go to your startup.cs and then go under the configure services here. And inside the cookie authentication handler here, we can specify where the login page is, right? So we can say login path. Right? So in here, we can just specify account and then login. Right, we can specify account 1 because we applied account 1, right? If we specify this here, right? And just pay attention that here, we haven't even logged in yet. So this is still part of authentication. That's why we're configuring authentication. We're not configuring authorization yet, right? So let's run the application again. And then this time it successfully located the login page under account 1, right? So let's change it back to account and let's change this to the folder back to account. And that is supposed to work. All right, so let's input our username and password. And now we successfully accessed our index page, right? Our welcome page. And from our developer tool, we can see the cookie is present now. Okay, so let's delete this cookie for now. And then close this developer tool. Just close the window, going back to our code. The next thing I want to show you is that placing the attribute, right, the requirement on the page or on any endpoint requires the middleware to be present, right? So because if you place a requirement there and there's no middleware and then nothing is dependency injected, then it's not going to do anything and it's actually going to throw an error. So let's see what happens there. So because we already have the authorization middleware placed right over here, right? So if we comment this out and then we run it, let's see what happens now. Now we can see it throws an error and the error is very descriptive. It says that this endpoint index contains authorization metadata, but a middleware was not found that supports authorization, right? And then it tells you what to do. Well, you can see that Microsoft has come up with really nice, really detailed error messages for developer to code. Many years ago, it isn't this case. Anyways, this is what I want to show you, that if you decorate a endpoint with your requirement, you have to specify the authorization. Right, so next, let's add another page here. And then let's call this page the HR department. Right, so this is going to be the HR department landing page. And we're going to create a reader page, which is a empty one. And then let's call it human resource. And let's add some styling. Let's use the same styling and copy and paste that over to our human resource CS HTML page over here. And then, so this is, we're going to change the title here to human resource. We're going to delete this learn about here. We need to specify a policy that requires the department claim to see whether the department is HR. And then we assign this requirement to the policy. And then we apply this policy to the page. So in order to specify the requirement and group the requirements into the policy, we need to configure authorization, right? And you know where we should go. We should go to startup.cs and then go under configuration service, configure services here. This one dependency inject a lot of services for authentication purpose. Of course, we have another one that is similar to this, which is add authorization, right? So we'll dependency inject services as well as figuring authorization over here. And what we can do with the options here is that we can add a policy, right? And then we can give the policy a name. So this one is, let's call it must belong to HR department. So this is the policy name. And then you can see that we need to specify how this policy works with action delegate, right? And for that, we can just use lambda expressions and then we can say policy.require, and we're gonna require claim. The claim type is department, and the value has to be HR. We have added our first policy here. We added this claim to this policy, right? And now we can apply this policy on our human resource page, and we can go over here and we can apply this against the same attribute, authorized attribute, do control dot to import the namespace. And over here we can say policy equals this policy name. So now what we are saying is that the user must have a claim that satisfies this policy. And what this policy is really asking for is very simple. It requires the department claims value to be HR. Right? At this moment, if we go to our login page, right, we created our claim to only have the name and email. We don't have a department claim yet. So at this moment, if I do Control F5, it's going to build the application and it's going to run the application, and then we'll see what happens. Right? First of all, I got to log in, and then I'm going to insert my password over here. Okay, so no problem accessing the index page. But if we're trying to access our HR, our human resource page, I'm going to hit enter. It's going to tell me access denied. You see the access denied, and it's trying to say that, hey, the access denied page is not there, right? So you can see that again, this is by default, the access denied page supposed to be under the account page. And if we were to specify where the access denied page is, we're again going back to startup.cs. Then you can see we specify the login page, right? And then we can specify the access denied page right over here. Right, so we can explicitly specify this, and then we can just copy this name, and then we just add another Blazor page. Click on add, specify the name is access denied. Coming over here, and again, we're gonna say our title is access denied. And then here we're gonna say you don't have access to the page you are looking for. So with this simple change, if we access our human resource page again, it redirected us to the access denied page. Right? This looks a little bit better than before. So then how do we gain access to our human resource page? The answer is pretty simple. We go to our login page. And then here we are going to add another claim here. We're going to add a department claim, right? This is the type. And then the value, we're going to say HR. And this has to be exactly the same as where we configured on the startup.cs. Here, we're going to say the type name is department, right? And the value is HR. And so here, the claim type name is department and the value is HR. So with this change, again, let's run it once again. Right, so you can see that I am logged in already because I didn't close all of my browsers. So the cookie is still
inside here, right? So this is the old cookie. It doesn't have the new claims. So I have to delete this. And if in this case, at this moment, if I refresh, it takes me to the login page where I'm going to re-authenticate. And then I'm going to click on the login page. Now my cookie regenerated. This cookie will contain the new claim. So now let's try to access our human resource page. You see, now we have access to our human resource page. So this is a simple condition here, right? We're just checking whether or not our cookie contains this particular claim, right? What if we want to check a presence of a certain claim? Again, in a simple case, for that, we are going to create a, let's create a control panel page, or let's create a settings page. Let's call it settings page. Right? And this settings page can only be accessed by a admin. We're not going to do anything on the page, but in here, we are going to add the authorize attribute, and then import namespace here, and then specify the policy to be admin only. Right, so this is the admin only policy, which we haven't configured yet. We're going to come over here and we're going to add the admin only policy. Right, so let's add the admin only policy on the top. The sequence doesn't really matter here. I'm just thinking admin is really one of the first to come to mind. So we're going to just specify it on the top. And then here, we're going to say policy, again, using lambda expression. We're going to say policy dot require claim, and then you can see there is a signature which only takes the claim type, and in this case it's admin claim, right? And then we have already applied this admin only policy on the settings page, right over here, admin only policy. Next thing we need to do is in the login page, we need to make sure that we're gonna add another claim, and this claim's name is admin. And well, this value doesn't really matter, but let's set it to true. We're gonna run Control F5, and again we're gonna clear our cookie because we didn't have a sign out page and I didn't close my browser. So I'm gonna refresh this again, coming back to the login page. Try to log in again in order to get the admin claim. So now I have this cookie newly generated, and this should contain our admin claim. And now I can access, right? I can access the settings page. Without this claim, you won't have access to it. Let's see what happens if we do that. Again, delete this cookie. Refresh the page, try to log in, go into index page. Now manually navigate to the settings page, and now it says access denied, right? And this is exactly what's supposed to happen. And what if we create a human resource manager page, right? So let's add another page, and let's call it HR manager, right? So the HR manager page contains, some information or something for the HR manager to do. So this is the HR manager page. And then here we are going to specify a policy to be HR manager only, something like that. Right, so that's good. And now let's configure this policy, and it's just HR manager only. Is that what we specified? HR manager only. And over here, again, we're going to say policy dot require claim. We're going to copy this, right? And then we can chain it by saying require claim. So let's change the format a little bit so that it looks better. So when we chain it, what we are really saying is that we need this claim to be like this, and we need the next claim, which is a manager claim, to be present as well, right? So this is a AND. From this claim to this claim is an AND relationship. So once we've done that, we can close this off. And of course, we already had a department, HR department, and then the manager claim is not there. If we're running this just like that, without the manager claim, we are expecting to see access denied page, right? Of course, first of all, we need to clear this cookie again. F5 to see the login page, and then input your username and password. Click on the login page. Now navigate to the HR manager page, and we see the access denied, right? So in order to fix that, we need to go to our login page, and over here we are going to add a manager claim. Again, the value doesn't really matter because we're just checking the presence of the claim, but just to make it complete, so we add a true as the value. And then we're going to build it, coming back to here, delete this cookie, and refresh the page. We're going to log in. Now the cookie should have the manager claim in it. It also has the HR department claim in it, and we should be able to access our HR manager page just like that. So we can see the HR manager page. So in this video, we have seen how we group different claims into policy, right? We have simple ones, and we have combinations. In the next video, we are going to create a more complicated case where we have specific logic, right? And then we would have to create this requirement handler, right? The authorization handler to specifically handling that requirement, right? And we're going to see it in the next video. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. If not, I'm going to see you in the next one. So we have seen this cookie have been always here, as long as if I keep the browser open, right? So even after I close the tab, if I have another Chrome browser open, this cookie will always stay in there. So in this video, before we go any further, let's implement a sign out functionality so that we can get rid of this cookie when we click on the sign out button. If we come to our login page, we can see that we have the sign in async extension method. So this sign in async helps us to serialize the claims principal, right, the security context, into a cookie. Similarly, there is a sign out async that can help us to get rid of the cookie. So we can implement that in the logout page. Let's go ahead and create a logout page under the account folder, right? Razor page. Let's simply call it logout. And for this page, we don't need to have any UI. The only thing we would need is a onPost method, and of course it's going to be onPost async because we are going to use sign out async. And then after that we need to do a redirect. So we will need to implement this very similar to the sign in method. We'll try to use the HTTP context, the sign out async method. This is not in HTTP context. This is an extension method. We'll do a control dot to import a namespace from ASP.NET Core.Authentication. And then here we'll have a authentication scheme name, which is our authentication scheme name. We'll have to specify, right? Like I said before, it's better to use a constant for this in case we have a typo. So, but for demonstration purpose, I'm not going to have it. So because we will need to do a redirect, that's why we need to have a wait there. So we're going to redirect to our index page, just like that. And that's it for our logout page, right? We don't need a UI. So who's going to call this? Who's going to trigger this onPost, right? So someone has to post to this logout page. So for that, we'll need to create a partial view. We're going to put it in the layout page where we have this header, right? We're going to put it somewhere here for us to click the logout button. So we can definitely just code it
directly in the layout page, but we can also create a partial view. So I like to create a partial view for that. And for creating a partial view, it's really simple. It's very similar to, it's almost the same as in MVC. So instead of using this add razor page thing, which currently doesn't have a really good support for creating partial view, I'm just going to copy this validation script partial. I'm going to paste it in here, and then I'm going to change the name to be underscore login, let's call it login status partial. Okay, and within here, of course, we don't need this. We'll need just some razor syntax here. We're going to say if the user, right, if the user.identity, if the default identity is authenticated, right? If it's not a anonymous one, then we're going to do something. Otherwise, if it is anonymous identity, then we'll do something else. Let's implement the simplest case, which is the anonymous one. So we're going to have a link, which just looks like a link button, and we're going to use btn-link class, and then we're going to use tag helper to link to a page, which is inside our account folder, and it is the login page, of course, and the label is login. And then here, when the user is authenticated, we need to allow user to click on a button to log out, right? So for that, we need to have a form, right? And the form behavior is post, meaning, you know, clicking on the submit button in the form will post to a certain page. And this form is going to use the inline class, and it's going to be linked to the logout page, right, under the account folder. So, and we're going to display a welcome message first. We're welcoming the user to the system. Use the default identity, and then we're going to have a button, and the type is going to be a submit button, and the class, we're going to have a little bit margin here, and same thing, we're going to use a link button, and it's a logout as the label. When user click on this button, this is going to trigger a HTTP post, and then this is going to be post to the logout page, which we have just implemented here. So when this page handler receives the HTTP post request, it's going to simply sign out, which means it's going to kill the cookie and then redirect to the index page. Now we have created this partial view. We have to use it in the layout, and we're going to use it right here. So first of all, we'll have a div to wrap around it, and I'm going to use a class so that it's going to have, it's going to align to the right. We're going to use margin right. And then we're going to use the partial tag helper to use our login status partial view here. Okay, so we're all set, and I'm doing Control F5. Okay, so we have a login button here, but because the index page is already protected, so we're seeing the login page anyways. We don't have to click on the login button. And then I'm going to use the password, and now we're logged in, right? And if we go to our privacy page, go to our home page, they're all working correctly. And then we are going to click on the logout button while we are in the privacy page. Click on the logout button, right? So this, we expect us to kill the cookie, right? So let's bring up the cookie. I can see the cookie right here. We expect this to kill the cookie and also redirect us to the index page. But because the index page is protected, it will automatically redirect us again to the login page. All right, so this is what happened. You can see that the cookie is deleted, and because the cookie is not present anymore, when accessing any page, the authentication middleware will not be able to pick up the security context. So it will have a anonymous identity, which on any of our pages except privacy page are not allowed. Right? So that's the login status partial view. and logout functionality implemented. In later videos, we're going to talk more about the lifetime of a cookie and how is it correlated with the browser session. But next video, we'll continue with authorization first. 2 videos ago, we have implemented simple authorization policies where we were simply checking the existence of a claim or specific values of claim. In this video, we are going to implement some more complicated scenarios where we're checking some custom logic other than just checking the presence of a claim or the specific value of the claim. So let's imagine a scenario where you are hired as a human resource manager, and you can access, of course, you can access human resource manager page, whereas the permission is only given when you pass your probation period, right? So for example, you have a 3 months probation period, and within the 3 months, although you're given the main claim and HR department claim, you still haven't passed your probation period, you won't be able to access the page, right? So that's going to be a custom requirement which we're going to implement, and then we have to implement the authorization handler to help us to handle the requirement. And then in the handler, we can say whether the security context satisfies the requirement or not. Okay, so let's jump into Visual Studio and get started right away. So first of all, let's go into our login page, right? So here, we will need some extra claims here. We need to have a claim which contains the employment date of the person who is logged in, right? So the employment date, let's say the employment date is May 1st, 2021. So 2021, 0501. So this is May 1st. So we added this claim. The next step, we need to create a requirement, which we will create it under the authorization folder. So let's create a authorization folder, which will contain all of our custom requirement, right? If we have many. In this case, we only have one, but we'll still have it in the folder. So we'll create a class, right? And we're gonna call the class HR Manager Probation Requirement. That sounds like a meaningful name. And for any requirement, we'll have to derive that requirement from iAuthorization requirement interface, right? iAuthorization requirement interface. This interface doesn't have anything in it. If we go to the definition, right, we can see it's empty. So the reason why we need it, I'll explain you why we need this interface a little bit later. So in here, we're going to have the probation period passed in, right? So probation, let's say probation month. I'm going to do control dot to initialize it as a public property, right? So we have this public property here. And then inside the namespace, we're going to create the handler right here, right? So we're going to have a public class, which will have this name. So it's not requirement, it's requirement. Right, so we'll have to change the name of the file as well. So I'm going to copy this name, and then I'm just going to call it HR Manager Probation Requirement Handler. And this will have to derive from the Authorization Handler class. And here you can see we have a T requirement, and this T requirement is a iAuthorization requirement, right? So that's why we need this iAuthorization requirement here, right? Although this is an empty interface, we just need it so that we can have this handler implemented properly, right? So I put in this requirement here, and then you can see the red squiggly line here. I'm just going to do control dot to implement the abstract class, right? So I hit enter. So we'll have a virtual method overridden here. And we can see that this requirement is passed in through this method, right? So we can implement this method. Basically here, we just need to get the employment date and then to see whether we have passed the probation period. So how do we get the claim? So we can check in the context. In here, we can access the user, which is the claims principal, right? And then has claim a method here, and we can say, is there a claim whose type is employment date? It's better we use a constant for this name, but for demonstration purpose, we're not going to do that. So we can use the if condition statement here, right? So if it doesn't exist, and this is when we need to say, we don't say we fail, right? We don't need to. We just need to basically return the empty task here. The reason why we don't want to say it fails is that if it fails, then the policy will fail no matter what. But in some cases, we want to have multiple requirements within the policy. So if one of them satisfies, then it's okay, right? We don't want to return just a failure like that. So after this line, we know that we have an employment date claim. So we just need to get the date here, right? So we can use datetime.parse to parse the claim. So we use the claim principal to find our first employment date claim. And we know we have it, so we're pretty sure we have it. So then we can just access the value, and then we parse that. So now we have the employment date, and we just need to compare the differences, right? So the probation period, right? The probation period is datetime now minus employment date. Okay, so basically we're just going to say if the period dot days, right? So this, if you hover over, you can see this is a time span object. So if the period dot days is greater than 30 times requirement, right? We have our probation period, probation month here. So we can say requirement dot probation month, right? Because this requirement is passing from here, from this parameter. So we can just use that. And then here we're going to say text.succeed. So we're going to call the succeed method. And then we want to make this particular requirement succeed. Right? And then after that, we still return an empty task like that. So now that we have the requirement and the handler, we will need to go to the startup class to register. I'm going to do control comma and startup. We need to go to startup.cs, and then we'll change this HR manager policy a little bit. We'll need to add something here. We're going to add requirements to this policy, right? So this is a requirement, which is requiring the claim, and this is also a claim requirement, and this is a customer requirement, and we just say .requirements.add. We're going to add this authorization requirement, right? Which we already have implemented. And from here, we can pass in the probation period, right? You can keep it in the settings, in the app settings if we want. But in this case, for demonstration purpose, I'm going to hard code here. So 3 months of probation period. And then we are going to do a control dot to import the namespace. We also need to dependency inject this particular requirements handler. And for that, we can just add the handler to the service collection, right? And in this case, we can use singleton, or we can use transit or scope. It doesn't really matter. But using singleton will improve the performance just a little bit because it does not need to recreate the class all the time, right? So I'm going to do a control dot to import namespace here, and also the requirement handler. That's it. We have this requirement, and this is already on our HR manager page, right? We don't have a HR manager page menu. So let's just quickly add that. And that is in our layout page. So let's just add another list item, have our HR manager page here. Okay, again, coming back to this diagram, just so that we know exactly what's happening. So if we're trying to access this HR manager page, right, the authorization middleware will grab the policy name, and then it will go through all of the requirements and find their handlers, right? Because we have this handler specified to handle that specific event, where we specified right here, right? So this handler is kind of bound to this requirement, right? So we have this handler to handle the specific, sorry, not event, the specific requirement, right? Therefore, our requirement handler will determine whether the security context will actually satisfy the requirements, right? So this is the theory. And then we have already implemented, so let's give it that a try. I'm going to do a Control F5 to run the application. All right, I'm going to log in as the admin, and then I'm accessing the next page. Well, I'm going to change the privacy, going to change the label here in the layout. So this is not privacy, this is HR management. Coming back, refresh the page. All right, so let's click on the HR management. Access denied. Why is access denied? Okay, so we can see that our requirement actually has a 3 months configuration here, right? And in the login, in the claim, the employment date is May 1st, right? So that's from May 1st to today's date, which is May 15th, right? So it's not going to work. So if we set it to February 1st, then that's way past 3 months. So that should work, right? So let's give that a try. I'm going to do Control Shift B. All right, build succeeded. So let's first log out to kill the cookie, because the cookie still contains May 1st as the employment date. So let's just log out to kill the cookie. And then we're going to log in again. So now the cookie is supposed to contain February 1st as the employment date. And if we go to the HR management page, we can see the HR manager page, right? So that is for this video, where we have implemented this custom requirement and the custom requirement handler, right? So you can have pretty complicated requirement, and then all you have to do is just implement this authorization handler to handle the specific requirement. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. If not, I'll see you in the next video. So once the login process finishes here, a cookie is generated as an authentication ticket. The cookie may or may not have an expiry date and time. As developers, we have the power to choose to set the expiry date and time or not. And that expiry date and time is also affected by browser session. So in this video, we are going to talk about the lifetime of a cookie and how it's affected by the browser session. So like I said, we can choose to control the lifetime. And the way to do so is to come to the startup.cs. And then when we add a cookie authentication handler, we can come over here and say options, right? And then we can specify the expiry time span. Right, so we can say we're going to expire in about, let's say in about 30 seconds, right? So if we do that, and then I'm going to run Control F5, and I'm going to log in, and we watch the time, it might start at 45. So when it goes to 5:38:15, the authentication ticket, which is the cookie, will expire. Now it comes to 15. So if I go to, for example, this, or going back, see, it does not work. So as you can see, we can configure to have a lifetime, right? And when we have a lifetime, the cookie will expire when the time comes. But what happens if we close the browser before the cookie expires? Let's try that. Okay, so I'm going to log in, and then right after this, I'm going to close the whole browser. So I'm going back to the page again, and as you can see, we don't have a cookie anymore, right? Because closing the browser it automatically deleted the cookie. So how is browser session affects the lifetime of a cookie? So let's talk about that now. First of all, what is a browser session? Right? A browser session is basically an interaction between the browser and the server. Right? So the browser session lasts as long as the lifetime of the browser. So as soon as you close the browser, the session is finished. So that's the browser session. So if we draw two bars, right, the first bar represents the lifetime of the cookie. The second one represents the lifetime of the session, browser session. So how is the browser session lifetime affects the cookie lifetime, right? So if the browser's lifetime is longer than the cookie lifetime, basically it does not affect the cookie's lifetime. The cookie will expire when the time comes, right? At this moment, it will expire. If the browser session is shorter than the cookie lifetime, of course, so the cookie's actual lifetime is right here, right? Because the browser is closed, the cookie is gone, right? But there is an exception where you as a developer can set the cookie as a persistent cookie, which means that the cookie will survive the browser's closing. Right? So even when the browser is closed, the cookie will still stay there. So this is called persistent cookie. Right? A persistent cookie will always have the lifetime as you set for the cookie. Let's say the browser is closed here, and then after some time the browser is open again. This time the session is a little bit longer, the browser session is a bit longer. The cookie will still expire at this moment right there. So how do we set a cookie as a persistent cookie? You have all experienced the login screen where you see there's like keep me signed in or remember me checkbox. When you check that checkbox, then the cookie becomes a persistent cookie. So let's implement that in our Visual Studio. So first of all, we need a model, right? Page model that includes a checkbox, which is going to be a Boolean variable here, right? So we're gonna call it remember me, and then we're gonna have a better display name with a space in between. So we're gonna say remember me, just like in Coco. And then we are going to go to the login page here, and then we are going to add a row here, right? Let's say this is going to be a row, and then we're gonna use form check, right? And then we are gonna have a little bit margin at the bottom. Because this is not a form group, right? So it doesn't have enough margin at the bottom. So we're gonna add a little bit margin there. And then in between, we're gonna have the same thing here. And we are going to change this to a checkbox. This is going to be a data binding here, and we're gonna bind to remember me. And then the class is going to be form check, right? Form check input, and it does not need to have a value here. And then we'll need a label for that checkbox, right? And this is going to be called form check label. And of course, this is going to be for the same field, which is remember me, and then that's it. Right. So with this, we are going to receive, once it's posted, right? The form is posted. We're going to receive that value in the credentials in the remember me field. So what we need to do is before we sign the cookie, right? Sign in and create the cookie, we need to have another variable that's called authentication properties, right? And we're going to create that authentication properties. You can see this right here, and then there's a whole bunch of things you can configure here. One thing that is important to us is this is persistent thing. We're gonna make it persistent only when the user check the checkbox. So when the remember me is true, right? So we'll have this authentication property, and then we're going to pass it as the third parameter. You can see that the third parameter here is the authentication property, right? So with this, let's give it a try. Let's double check what is the 30 seconds. Okay, so we have a 30 seconds cookie. That is too short for our experiment because we want to try to close the browser and then come back and see that the cookie still works, right? So let's have a 2 minutes cookie first, and then I'm gonna do Control F5. All right, so we're gonna log in, and this time I'm gonna check remember me. And if I click, I'm logged in right now. And then I'm gonna close the browser and I'm gonna open it up again. All right, so the browser is open. You can see that we're still here. We don't have to log in, right? Our cookie is still here. No, this one, right? Our cookie is still here. That is a persistent cookie. Now, the persistent cookie is still subject to the expiry date. And to test that, let's have a shorter cookie, which we change back to 30 seconds lifetime, and then we are going to test that. Okay, so let's log in again. We're going to log in, and then immediately I'm going to close the browser, and I'm going to open up the browser again. So I did this within 30 seconds, so I'm still logged in, right? So let's wait for another 15 seconds. Okay, now if I refresh my screen, my cookie has already expired. When I refresh my screen, I expect that I'm kicked out because my cookie is not valid anymore. So, and I refresh my screen, I see my login page, and that's exactly what's supposed to be. So hopefully this video is helpful to help you understand the relationship between the cookie lifetime and browser session lifetime. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And if not, I'll see you in the next video.